I've had family members who are in their heart of hearts not transphobic. Like deep down, they are like, I'm for trans rights, and I'm for all this stuff. It's just like, you lose me when it gets to the children, because I like, kids are kids, right? Like they don't know a lot of things. I mean, kids are stupid, and like, what if they're just like trying to follow a fad or something, or what if it's just like, this or that? Like I don't know. It's just like, why would we give them something that's permanently going to change them if they in fact are going to change their minds later? Arm yourself with all the pushback you can against all of those points, and it's very, very simple. They are reversible. Puberty blockers are reversible. The majority of people who do transition, even early in life, do not regret it overwhelmingly. So if the majority of people who transition do not regret it, in fact they find that it helps alleviate their gender dysphoria, it helps their quality of life, then for the very small minority of them who do, you are advocating on their behalf and endangering the majority of the rest in that process. All the trans children who want to transition, you are going to endanger their lives in that process. Trans youth are facing right-wing attacks and a solidarity shortage. What we have is a situation where our opponents are fixated on us and our allies are leaving us behind, says trans attorney and activist Chase Strangio. Republicans have made attacks on trans youth a signature policy item at the state level. In this episode of Movement Mentos, Kaylee Hayes and Chase Strangio talk about the avalanche of transphobic legislation Republicans have generated, the role of fascist politics in the onslaught, and why trans students are not getting the support they need from liberals or the left. In 2022, what we're seeing nationally is a really all-in-out assault on trans people, particularly trans young people and a state legislator. That looks like we're not just seeing an escalation of what we've seen year after year, really beginning in 2016, when we started to see the so-called bathroom bills really emerge as a sort of backlash to marriage equality, and in some sense a product of mainstream LGBTQ plus movements' failures to center and lift up trans people in the mainstream fights for things like same-sex marriage and military inclusion. So in 2016, you really start to see the insidious attacks on trans people, but is there a significant backlash this time? When North Carolina passed HB 2 in 2016, you had a national outcry. You had the United States suing the state. Leagues moved their championship games. The NCAA moved their final tour. Businesses pulled out of North Carolina. Query whether that type of boycotting of a state is a strategic move from a progressive standpoint. But nonetheless, when you look at the national picture, there was a huge response to that sort of escalation of attacks on trans people in 2016. Between 2016 and 2020, because of that, attacks on trans people in the restroom context really waned. This was, of course, during the Trump administration, when state legislators could rely on the federal government to be sort of discriminator in chief with respect to trans people. But in state legislators between 2016 and 2020, we're really seeing a decline in legislative attacks on trans people. And then when that starts to happen in 2020 is when we start to see an acceleration of attacks and a real pivot from our opponents. Even strategic, ever well-funded, ever suppressing voters and taking off state legislators, there was a shift in 2020. We started seeing well-coordinated efforts by national groups shipping our pre-drafted legislation to conservative lawmakers across the country and state legislators, focusing on two primary things. The first was banning healthcare for transgender minors, and the second was banning trans women and girls in particular, and actually banning all trans youth from athletics. Those bills really started to pick up in 2020, but in part because of the COVID pandemic and the shortened legislative session, only one bill passed. And now what we're seeing in 2021 led to the passage of approximately 13 anti-trans bills targeting trans youth, including 3 bills in Arkansas, multiple bills in Tennessee, and definitely the peak of bills introduced across the country targeting the trans community. And now in 2022, we're surpassing even what we saw in 2021. The bills are moving more quickly. They are broader in scope, and we're seeing a resurgence of old friends or foes like the bathroom bill. We've only a few weeks into the state legislative sessions, and we are seeing states pushing so many bills, reviving bills even after they're defeated in committees, bringing bills back, and we see them pass in the previous year just to expand upon them. It's really like nothing I've ever seen in terms of the magnitude of the attack, and there's almost no public response in opposition. And that's part of why it's happening, because in 2016, lawmakers felt like after HB 2 passed, the bathroom bill, the conversation really shifted, that they couldn't get away from targeting trans people. When they saw this in 2021, but they absolutely could get away with targeting trans people. And now what we're seeing in 2022 is that they're using the free reign to attack trans people. And they're doing it alongside a lot of scary things, like attacks on abortion, voter suppression bills, attacks on books and history and words in the classroom, and this sort of distorted notion of parental rights that's escalating across the country. And with all these things that is happening, we're seeing very little resistance to the bills targeting trans people, many of which are catastrophic in nature, that could literally cut off life-saving care to trans people. And I think for me, one of the things that's been most disheartening has been the reminder that in the context of these bills, they target the whole LGBTQ community. So things like restrictions on teachings related to sexual orientation or gender identity, we do get a larger outcry. We hear from the White House, we hear from national leaders, we hear from businesses. Even if we had to compare, the 35 bills restricting healthcare for trans youth are much more dangerous in nature. There's very little support when the bills target just trans people, and especially when they target trans youth. So what we have is a situation where our opponents are fixating on us and our allies are leaving us behind. According to the Trevor Project, an organization that you should all check out and support if you have $1 to spare, 85% of transgender and non-binary youth say that recent debates around anti-trans bills have negatively impacted their mental health. Again, 85% of transgender and non-binary youth saying these debates are impacting negatively their mental health. The organization also found out that 71% of transgender and non-binary youth feel scared about the future. I can't see why. I've been doing trans advocacy work for 20 years. I'm a trans person myself. I'm a parent, and I've never seen the level of fear and sadness amongst trans young people and their parents and loved ones that I'm seeing right now, because the single most terrifying thing for so many trans people that I know, particularly trans young people who have fought to be believed as who they are, is to lose their health care. And we are now in a situation where bills are being proposed that would make it a felony potentially for doctors to treat their patients with standard for care medicine, that young people might rely on for a period of 8 years before they're 18 years old. Or is the case with Alabama's prohibition, it would be 19 years old. In the case of Mississippi's prohibition, it would be 21 years old. So this is really scary for people to think about. I had to fight so hard to be believed as me. I had to fight so hard to get this healthcare, which is already really hard and inaccessible, like all healthcare is in this country. And now it's becoming a crime to receive it. And some families are fleeing the states that they live in, trying to find safer homes for their families. And that means leaving people potentially older relatives, businesses, jobs, and communities. Last year, Arkansas passed a ban on healthcare for trans minors and people had to pick up and leave in some cases when they had the means to. Thankfully, we were able to sue and stop the law before it came into effect, but the fear that people have in experiencing it is so heightened. And in some states, these bills would make it a form of child abuse for a parent to affirm their trans child. So, if you can imagine now, parents are walking around scared that the state will take away their child if they provide them with a loving home. And obviously, when we think about the history of the so-called child welfare systems in this country, they are systems that have been designed to target largely communities of color, particularly Black and Indigenous communities. And now we're adding upon that the fear for these communities that are already targeted disproportionately could be at risk for losing a child because they love their child, because they support their child, because they're treating them with consistent with who they know themselves to be. So people are really scared. Young people are missing school to go testify at state houses when they should be managing the already challenging circumstances of growing up and going to school in a pandemic. And we all know from the data that even just the introduction and the debate over these bills has caused a spike in adverse mental health consequences for trans young people. Because when people in power are debating whether or not you should go to a bathroom or place on a sports team or have access to your health care, that in and of itself, that conversation, even if the bill never passes, is harmful. One that is had almost exclusively, I'd say, online by cis people, by the way. Cis people debating other cis people on whether or not trans people have a right to exist. And it's not only something that young people are internalizing, it's messaging that other people are receiving when it's increasing the risk that these young trans people experience violence in their schools or in their homes or on the street, because people in power are legitimizing the types of discourse and sentiment. So Greg Abbott has officially directed Family and Protective Services to begin investigating all trans children in Texas and prosecuting their parents as child abusers. He's also instructed all teachers, doctors, and caregivers to begin reporting any trans students they see. This is utterly and completely fucked up to be happening again in 2022. Again, the year we're supposed to have flying cars, time travel, and all these cool things. Talking robots that aren't trying to kill us, but are actually supposed to be our friends. All the shit I was promised as a kid. Instead, it's fucking regression. It's going backwards. It's seeing the same shit that has happened time and time again to every other marginalized community throughout the history of this country. And by this country, I mean the United States. He's also instructed all teachers, doctors, and caregivers to begin reporting any trans students they see. Like, that part is just chilling. Dear Commissioner Masters, consistent with our correspondence in August 2022, the Office of Attorney General has now confirmed in the enclosed opinion that a member of the so-called sex change procedure constitutes child abuse under the existing Texas law. Because the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services is responsible for protecting children from abuse, I hereby direct your agency to conduct a prompt and thorough investigation of any reported instances of these abusive procedures in the state of Texas. As OAG Opinion KP 0401 makes clear, it is already against the law to subject Texas children children to a wide variety of elective procedures for gender transitioning, including reassignment surgeries that can cause sterilization, mastectomies, removals of otherwise healthy body parts, and administration of puberty-blocking drugs. Now, here's the fucked up thing about this. This is not happening to kids. Like, trans kids are not having these operations, but you've lumped it in with something that is happening to trans kids, or needs to, in order to help the gender dysphoria. And once again, you've lumped the two into the same thing, as every fucking pundit has been doing as long as I've been covering this shit. You know, people were shocked to see me furious at Joe Rogan like 3 years ago. And they were like, well, he's just bringing guests on. What's the big deal? I was like, he's platforming every fucking transphobe in the intellectual dark weeb, putting them on his show and giving them a chance to talk about this shit, giving them an opportunity to come on there and be like, hey, by the way, this is child abuse. Hey, by the way, giving kids puberty blockers is going to have negative effects for their health outcomes. And it's actually child abuse, and we should actually do something about that. And then to millions of people who listen to that shit, which is just patently false. It's unscientific, all right? It's pseudoscience. It's like the same thing people used to justify their racism by saying that, like, we can measure skulls. If we measure the shape of skulls, we can see that certain races are more intelligent than other races. So therefore, you know, my bigotry is completely justified by science. The same shit is being done today. In the year 2022, people are using their misunderstanding of how this shit works in order to pass legislation that will directly and negatively impact trans people. It is absolutely fucked up. And yes, cruelty is the point at the end of the day, because this bill doesn't even put into account the fact that cis kids may need puberty blockers at some point in their lives. Like, this whole thing has completely ignored any of the science on this issue. When you have a situation in which you have trans children and they experience gender dysphoria and they are going through puberty, a time that is fucked up and awkward for all of us. I'm saying this as a cis person, all right? As a cis person, puberty is not a fun ride. Puberty and everything that happens and all the shit that goes on around you. Oh yeah, okay, your voice starts cracking. Oh, okay, you're starting to get hair where there was no hair before. Oh, suddenly acne is like just a daily thing popping up everywhere. Yeah, it fucking sucks. Add to that you start, like, you know, becoming a gender that you do not identify with. Like, that is the part of it that, like, everything is already really fucked up being a kid in high school. Everything is already really fucked up being a kid in elementary school. There's already so much fucked up cruelty that goes on. Kids make fun of other kids all the time for nothing. Fucking nothing. Just being even slightly different. Oh, green shirt is here. You're wearing a green shirt today. Well, fucking, oh, green shirt. Oh, F slur. Oh, there's an F slur over there. They're wearing a green shirt. Doesn't matter what it is. Imagine, in addition to all of that, that you were going to go through puberty into a gender that you do not identify with. Like, that is in addition to everything that you already experience. So then when you pass these bills and you're just like, well, it's for the safety of children. No, this whole thing is to target trans kids, to now out them. Now, what do we have to have an accountability thing where it's like we have to now find every trans kid and make sure that we know that their parents aren't doing anything to help them. In fact, quite the opposite. We can't even let them identify as that. I mean, sure, I'm libertarian, all right? I'm not against trans people. I say live and let live. If you want to do that stuff in as an adult, that's totally fine. I just think that this entire thing is child abuse because I've read nothing on the fucking subject. Is basically where it leaves. Texas law also imposes a duty on the DFPS to investigate the parents of a child who is subjected to these abusive gender transitioning procedures, and on other state agencies to investigate licensed facilities where these procedures may occur. To protect Texas children from abuse, DFPS and other state agencies must follow the law as explained with the OAG opinion. Going after kids. This is the same party, by the way, that won't shut the fuck up about children and like the sanctity of conception and how every life is sacred. And then we, you know, at the moment that, you know, the egg is fertilized, therefore a soul exists within that child and they must be protected at all costs, and it's murder to do anything about it. So I think the state should now legislate people's bodies and force them to give birth, even if it's against their will. Yes, they should have no control in the matter because we must protect the sacred children. Meanwhile, fucking this at the same time. They're like the same party that talks about this shit is obsessed with it. If you adhere to duty to report in Texas, Texas is officially saying that you have to report trans youth to Family and Protective Services or risk losing your job. Unsurprisingly, Texas cites Tavistock versus Bell, the UK case that was later overturned that banned youth from transitioning care in the UK for a short time. The full letter is here. If you're a parent of a trans kid in Texas, now is the time to get out. We will help you in any way we can. Please reach out to me and make sure you signal boost this. Done. If you're in Texas, the safest nearby state to go to is likely going to be Colorado or New Mexico. If you're a parent with a trans kid looking to escape these issues from ever popping up again in your life, any state in dark green is best. Now, obviously, that is a really fucked up thing to have to say, because not everyone has the means or the network to do that. I mean, it's obviously, I completely understand why this person is doing it, and, you know, bless them. I'm not a religious person, but bless them for doing this and for trying to help people and for trying to create some kind of a support network for people who desperately need that. And if you have to do that and go down that dramatic road, then you should get all the support that you need. In the meantime, if you happen to be someone, especially someone with privilege like myself who is cis, speak out against this shit. Talk about this shit, because yes, it's not a solution for people to have to be like, well, I mean, they are clearly being very oppressive here, so we're gonna have to move to a next location. We're just gonna have to get up and uproot our family and go somewhere else. That cannot be the end of this. I mean, setting up support networks is necessary, and I'm very glad that exists. And at the same time, this shit needs to be pushed back again. Pushed back on. There needs to be the same level of outrage towards these kind of bills, these oppressive bills that marginalize communities, that torture children, that endanger families, because these are the things that the right in all their posturing always talk about when they clutch their fucking sanctimonious pearls and sit there and talk about how, oh yeah, it's incredibly important that we protect the children, while they pass legislation that directly will endanger kids. Like, make no mistake, this is endangering children. All the fucking right-wing pundits who like to come on and you know, talk about, trans kids have very high rates of suicide, you know, that's why, you know, maybe the fact that we see these enormous increases in the rates of people who identify as trans should be alarming. The reason those high rates of suicide exist is because of the stigmatization in society. The stigmatization that you are doing right now, if you have a microphone and a platform and you go on there and you either allow someone to come onto your show to talk about the shit with no knowledge of the subject, you know, and just spread it to millions and millions of people. And what happens if you happen to be a trans kid who's listening, or has a friend who's listening, or you're at a house of a friend and Joe Rogan comes on and Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder come on and they're saying all this fucking horrifying shit? Like, that is the reason that those high rates exist. So push back against that as well. Like, normalize, like, when you have a conversation with your family members, and trust me, I have been in many fucking fights with conservative family members, but normalize the idea of when someone comes out and says something that you know is blatantly false, to not just let it rest, to not be like, well, you know, I understand and respect that opinion. If someone is coming out and saying, well, yes, but, you know, giving kids puberty blockers is child abuse, like, push back against that. It doesn't have to be mean. You don't have to go out there and be like, you fucking transphobe, this is the end of this conversation. No, but explain to them and let them understand, and hopefully let them take home, or at least get a glimpse of the fact that what you were saying is just factually incorrect. It is child abuse to not allow children to have the health care they need. And yes, gender dysphoria should be covered. So if someone is experiencing that, let the medical professionals, who now, the overwhelming consensus on this in the scientific community is that not only is this not child abuse, that it can be fucking life-saving. That is how important this is. And again, this is a law being passed by people who most likely it will not directly affect. If it is just a whole bunch of old cis white dudes passing legislation when none of them happen to be trans, none of them have trans family members, it's just like, oh, out of sight, out of mind. Yes, we just have to do this to protect the kids while we oppress the children in the process. That is consistently what this shit is. And yes, they're going to tap it in and tie it into other cultural war issues, because maybe on its own, it's not going to be enormously popular. If you just leave it by itself, people are going to be like, well, I mean, you know, if you're only attacking trans children, this kind of seems unusual. I mean, maybe, okay, well, why don't we add it to an abortion bill? Why don't we add it to something else? Why don't we add it to all these other bills? Why don't we just encompass all the things that are fucking horrifying about our platform and do that, rather than ever helping people, by the way? Like, your entire fucking platform at this point is just, how can we get people enraged about culture war issues in a lot of times that don't directly impact them? The same shit was being done to the gay community when it came to marriage. Like, the majority of people who were looking to legislate against that, and I'm saying Republicans and Democrats in this case, fucking Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, were no fans of gay marriage for a long time, until it no longer was politically feasible to have that opinion. But at the same time, they're going to pass legislation that is directly going to impact gay couples, that is going to impact, lesbian couples, gay couples. It doesn't matter who it is. At the end of the day, it's most likely not going to impact them. They don't have to worry about having a gay marriage. And then all of a sudden, it might hit a little close to home when they have like a gay brother or a gay sister, and it's like, well, by the way, why are you trying to pass legislation that directly limits my rights? And it's like, well, it's the sanctity of marriage, you understand, the ancient procedure we used to treat women as property and exchange them. This was how the unification of families came together, and the Lord our God would make it a sanctimonious event, and we just don't want that institution to ever be sullied by the gay. So you understand, don't you? I'm not against your lifestyle. I'm completely, hey, you know, as an adult, just live and let live. You can do whatever you want. I just don't want you to have rights. That's it. You know, I'm going to be a proud libertarian in this. I just, at the end of the day, I don't want you to have certain rights. That's it. And I want to restrict your rights through this legislation. But I'm not saying that I'm against what you are. I understand, most likely. I mean, if you're fighting this tooth and nail for something like this, it's probably the way you were born. Okay, I'll acknowledge that. But that's as far as we're going. And I'm going to legislate stuff against you. You know, and time again. Someone in Mike from PA's chat said earlier, blockers are not permanent, but suicide is. I mean, that's a really sad but true statement. A very, very sad but true statement. And that's the other thing when people, arm yourselves, allies, arm yourselves with the information on this, arm yourselves with what argumentation works to convince minds, because yes, convincing people is very, very important. I've had family members who are in their heart of hearts not transphobic. Like deep down, they are like, I'm for trans rights, you know, and I'm for all this stuff. It's just like, you lose me when it gets to the children, because I like, kids are kids, right? Like they don't know a lot of things. I mean, kids are stupid, and like, what if they're just like trying to follow a fad or something, or what if it's just like, you know, this or that? Like, I don't know. It's just like, why would we give them something that's permanently going to change them if they in fact are going to change their minds later? Arm yourself with all the pushback you can against all of those points, and it's very, very simple. They are reversible. Puberty blockers are reversible. The majority of people who do transition, even early in life, do not regret it. Overwhelmingly. So if the majority of people who transition do not regret it, in fact, they find that it helps alleviate their gender dysphoria, it helps their quality of life, then for the very small minority of them who do, you are advocating on their behalf and endangering the majority of the rest in that process. All the trans children who want to transition, you are going to endanger their lives in that process. I'm heartened by the massive number of influential cis people sharing this break glass moment against the trans rights, but I'm also a little upset because this has been 3 years in the making, and we've been begging cis people to come to our aid and signal boosted stuff. 100% a fair call out. And to be honest, it's one of those things where, like, yes, I as a brave cis person do you know, episodes on trans rights. I'll do episodes where I rip into transphobes and try to push back against the rhetoric or whatever. But then entire months will go by where the only thing that seems to be in the news or talked about is the trucker convoy or is Ukraine, Russia. And then in that process, boom, I've got an entire episode where it's like, hey, by the way, this is about to happen in like 4 or 5 days. And it's like, okay, yeah, we'll get to that. But first, I got to spend 3 hours talking about the honkening. And here we go. And because this is where everything is focused until it's too late. And fucking guilty as charged right there. Thank you for all your messages, offerings of help, organizing. I need to step away for a few hours. I'm still recovering from surgery. I need to ensure that I have enough spoons to continue fighting on. I will rest for the messages of today. If you need immediate help, your best bets are the following. I can't promise they will help, but I've been told they are aware and currently organizing help.
Since January, as a mom, we send things, and she's been a little bit stressed out for the negative rhetoric. And the only way I have to let her know that Mom got this for you is for me to be here. Don't think that making ourselves visible, it's easy. It's not. It's difficult. But this is my way of letting her know that I will fight for her. Any parent does that for their children. We have people who are dying, committing suicide. Suicide rate amongst trans is really high, and that is our worst fear. And you are turning our worst fear into reality, where you're pushing kids. This is not about adults, this is about kids. Legislation is about children. You're supposed to protect them, and you're not protecting them. You are bullying children. We protect our kids from bullies, you are bullying them. We didn't put you, or we didn't vote you in so you can bully our children. and all the deaths that are going around, all the
Thanks,
suicides
Spiral.
that are
I just
happening
retweeted
as
it.
we speak, or the attempted suicides, are on your hands.
Yeah, it seems like every year we're having this conversation, marking it as the worst year, exceeding the previous year. It's a horrible situation in which we have an escalation of attacks on transgender young people. And again, this year, it's just the beginning of February. We have states across the country introducing over 150 bills targeting LGBTQ people, the majority of them aimed at trans young people. A state like Arizona, for example, has over 17 bills targeting our communities. And in this week, on one day alone, on Wednesday, we had 6 hearings in state legislatures across the country just focused on targeting trans kids. And these are bills, in some cases, that would make it a felony to provide healthcare to transgender young people, healthcare that is supported.
Yeah, honestly, Eris Pullman, I completely agree. I mean, if you're in Canada where there's, like, fortunately, a lot better laws in place and protections for members of the trans community, we should be talking about the idea of, trans refugees or families who are being persecuted unfairly in the U.S. and the ability to take them in if it comes to that.
By every major medical association in the United States, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association.
And I'm not saying things are perfect here. They're not. There's a lot of progress to be made, but it is still far better than what is going on in Texas.
In Alabama, a bill passed out of committee just this week that would do just that. In Arizona, they're considering a bathroom bill again. Talk about, being retro. This reminds us of 2016 when we had bathroom bills. But since then, we essentially came to the decision, I thought, that it was safe for kids to go to school and go to the bathroom with their peers. And yet here we are in 2022, and states around the country are trying to ban trans kids from the bathroom again. We have South Dakota considering such a bill, Oklahoma considering such a bill, Arizona hearing such a bill in committee next week. So we're really looking at a landscape in which kids are being...
Not to mention, can we bring this up? How much of this is also fucking trying to dominate the news from what is going on? Holy shit, this is big. The former chief of Texas Power Grid testified today that Greg Abbott instructed officials to charge the maximum amount for power during the winter storm. Texans still owe $3.4 billion. Ex-ERCOT chief says he was following Abbott's direction to halt blackouts when they ran up billions in bills during the freeze. The former head of Texas Power Grid testified in court on Wednesday that when he ordered power prices to stay at the maximum price cap for days on end during last year's frigid winter storm and blackout, running up billions of dollars in bills for power companies, he was following the direction of Governor Greg Abbott. Bill Magnus, the former CEO of the Electricity and Reliability Council of Texas, said even as the power plants were starting to come back online, former Public Utility Commissioner Chairman Deanne Walker told him that Abbott wanted them to do whatever necessary to prevent further rotating blackouts that left millions of Texans without power. She told me the governor had conveyed to her if we emerged from rotating outages, it was imperative they not resume. We need to do what we needed to do to make it happen. Last year, the governor's spokesman, Mark Miner, said the government was not involved in any way in the decision to keep prices at the maximum of $9,000 per megawatt hour, more than 150 times the normal price. He described the decision to send an aide to ERCOT's operations center in the middle of the crisis are based on the feeling the grid operator was spewing disinformation. As Texans would expect, Governor Abbott instructed everyone that they must do what is needed to keep the power on and to prevent the loss of life. This is the same instruction Governor Abbott gave to PUC and ERCOT earlier this year. Do what needs to be done to keep the power on. The decision to keep power prices at maximum cap is now at the center of a bankruptcy trial waged by Waco-based electrical company Brazos Electric. Brazos contends that the decision was made recklessly, adding up to $1.9 billion in the power bill from ERCOT that forced them into bankruptcy. It did nothing at all to cause more generations to come online. It was an attempted remedy that didn't solve any of the problems caused by the winter storm. The original order to raise power prices to the cap was made by the Public Utility Commission February 15th to try and get the power plants back online and encourage large power users like factories and petrochemical plants to stay offline. ERCOT elected to keep prices to the cap till February 19th, a decision that Texas Independent Market Monitor criticized in a report last year as having exceeded the mandate of the commission. The decision resulted in $16 billion in additional costs to ERCOT's market. Now Abbott is facing questions about his own culpability in the handling of last year's blackout. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Beto O'Rourke released a statement Wednesday claiming Abbott had once again put the profits of his donors over the people of the state. Abbott screwed us, and he'll continue to screw us until we vote him out. Didn't even buy us dinner first. Magnus, who was fired last year, has long defended his and other ERCOT officials' actions as necessary to keep the grid from slipping into total blackout that could take weeks or months to recover from. But in testimony testimony. A federal bankruptcy court in Houston Tuesday and on Wednesday had explained in detail how Walker had come to ERCOT's operations center in the middle of the crisis and relayed to him Abbott's demand that rotating blackouts come to an end. Magnus said he agreed that this was still a risk, explaining that even power plants that were starting to come back online on February 17th, the system was far from secure. Some power plants were still coming offline because coal or gas supply issues, but there was concern if power prices were allowed to return to normal market conditions, large power users might start coming back online and using critical power reserves. We're still seeing 40,000 megawatts of outages. At the peak, we had 52,000 megawatts, but 40,000 is still a lot. We saw the potential of load shed coming in again. And he described how so many hours of power outages there was a risk that Texas problems could cascade, explaining how water plants that had been relying on backup generation would soon run out of fuel if rotating blackouts resumed. And I don't care what else he said. The judge overseeing the trial, the U.S. bankruptcy judge David Jones, responded, "You're looking into the unknown. I don't think anyone would say we're not trying to do the right thing," he said. Interesting.
Being targeted in all aspects of their life when they're just trying to live.
It's so frustrating to see this unfolding. And Peppermint, you've been very vocal about the importance of trans representation. What is your reaction to seeing bills like this in the news every day, given your own lived experience?
It's infuriating. Like Chase said, it feels like we are going back in the past. And, you know, when I was in high school, it took some time for my family to come around, to be honest. And high school and school for me was a safe haven. My teachers, my classmates, a drama class was a safe place for me. And I think it's really important that that exists for all students, including LGBTQ and trans and gender nonconforming students.
It's so true. And Chase, why do you think in 2021 and 2022 we're seeing all of these bills pop up? Is it coordinated, and by who?
So two things. It is coordinated. It's coordinated by national groups with a lot of money that are sending model bills out to these state legislatures. It is not a constituent-driven movement. People have real problems to worry about in their lives. We are into year 3 almost of a pandemic. People want their lawmakers to address real problems, and yet you have these bills that are being drafted by well-funded organizations. I also think the reality is when you look at the national context, over the course of the last 3 years, there is a coordinated effort to suppress and attack many, many groups. And this is all part of the same movement. The voter suppression laws, the anti-so-called critical race theory laws, the anti-abortion laws, and the anti-trans laws. These are about consolidating power and harming marginalized communities. And every year is an escalation from the previous year. And if we don't address voting rights and we don't address these voter suppression bills, we're going to continue to see every year being worse than the previous year because these bills are flying through state legislatures at faster speeds than we've ever seen before. And more people are disenfranchised, are harmed. And if you can't go to the bathroom safely at school, then you can't go to school. If you can't get healthcare in your state, you can't live in that state. So we're talking about people's fundamental ability to survive.
Peppermint, last year was also the deadliest year for trans people, especially Black trans women. I mean, what do you think we can do to better protect trans people of color? I mean, we always ask this question, how to be a good ally, but how do you see it? How do we actually work together to protect trans people and be better allies to them?
I think we need to think of trans people as already a part of our families and our communities. You know, when we talk about BLM, that includes LGBTQ folks and trans folks, specifically trans women. When we're talking about protecting Black women, we're also talking about transgender Black women. You know, we are not a monolith, and we're not separate from any of these groups that Chase had mentioned earlier, and these hateful bills that keep coming back, and they keep trying to erode our rights from every corner. But one thing I wanted to point out is that many of the proponents of these bills admittedly haven't even had any real experience with trans children or the trans community. They're not even listening to the testimonials of these students that are, you know, pouring their hearts out at these, you know, school board meetings and such. And so, you know,
one piece of good international news, and thanks for sharing this link, Political Puppy. Best news I've received. I'm in tears as I'm reading this news. Things hopefully will get better for trans folks around the world, but Kuwait overturns law criminalizing trans identity in historic court ruling. Also took place. One of the I know people shit on the left all the time for infighting on online constantly, but one of the like amazing things about having like a leftist philosophy or worldview is that the struggle is an international one. It's an international struggle for oppressed people everywhere. I'm not trying to virtue signal right now, but that is something that is a very wonderful and reassuring part, is that when you hear about these struggles taking place for people in other countries, and I know people are always like, Lance, why do you talk about this country? You don't live there. Why are you talking about the UK? Why are you talking about the US? Because I want people to be liberated in every country. So if there are more civil rights taking place in other countries or whatever, it's a good thing. So, you know, congrats to every person living in Kuwait.
I think one of the things we have to do is, as people hear about this, understand that you may have someone who's transgender in your family and you don't even know. Maybe they didn't tell you, you know, maybe they were planning on it. I think we have to think a little bit larger and outside of the box when it comes to the trans community as a group that's connected to us.
So true. I want to end on a positive note. Say that again. I didn't hear you.
These laws, you know, if we think of these laws as separate, these discriminatory laws as separate, when they succeed at discriminating and excluding transgender children, that really does have an effect on all other children, you know, regardless of how they identify. And that's something that we should keep in mind.
So true. And I want to end on a positive note. Peppermint, I feel like you embody and exude a level of confidence that you don't see every day, and I want some of that. So where do you derive it from? And what do you do every day to remind yourself that you're a badass? Because I'm going to take notes, so just go, and I'm...
Oh, man. Roman Bear, I just brought up good news internationally. I'm trying to give everyone an internationalist perspective. Yeah, internationalism and cosmopolitanism, if you've read Michael Brooks' book. Well, folks, the Government National Board of Health and Welfare just announced new healthcare guidelines for trans youth. As expected, they're aiming to stop all hormonal treatment outside of a study that might be years away. Fuck. Well, Sweden is regressing as well, it would seem. To the Swedes, fight back against that. You don't want to keep getting labeled as the America of the region. Governor Greg Abbott campaign hands out empty fentanyl pill bottles at Beto O'Rourke event. A message inside the empty containers blamed the Democratic gubernatorial candidate for an influx of opioids coming through the state's southern border. That is just utterly and completely fucked. What a fucked up dude. Like, I don't have any better way to put it. You are just, like, this is just fucked up. Governor Greg Abbott appears to be ramping up campaign efforts against opponent Beto O'Rourke. The Democrat made a stop in Austin ahead of the March 1st primary to Keeping the Lights On campaign tour, which focuses on honoring lives lost during the deadly 2021 winter storm. Before the Texas congressman began his speech in front of hundreds of people in the street, members of Abbott's re-election campaign distributed empty fentanyl pill bottles to those in attendance before being escorted from the event. Jesus. I mean, this doesn't show whether it was directly done by Greg Abbott, though, was it? U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported 1,066% increase in the amount of fentanyl seized. 100,000 people died from drug overdoses. Synthetic opioids like fentanyl account for the majority of those deaths. I mean, you can keep trying to attack this problem, the problem of the opioid crisis, from the enforcement aspect, but the war on drugs has completely been lost. It's been lost, and it's costing countless lives. It's making everyone who stands to profit from it infinitely richer. You have to go with the harm reduction strategy.
I'm gonna use my pen here and take some notes.
It was funded by his re-election campaign. Oh, okay, well then fuck it. Greg Abbott, you're just fucking weird as fuck.
I'm seriously
Really, I'll call you and give you the recipe, darling. It's a special secret recipe.
What? No, you could give us all the recipe. Well, maybe like, okay, so one pro tip.
You know, having support from family and friends, chosen family for many people who are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, chosen family is a thing, but that can be a thing for all of us, especially those that move away from home to the big cities. And so having a group, a circle of friends, people who really get you and understand you, I think is key, especially in a situation, times like these, I'll just say. And so that keeps me going. My good Judies, my good girls.
I love that. Find your tribe. Chase and Peppermint, you are great, both of you. Thank you so much for being here. It's a tough issue to talk about and frustrating, but also we can end on that positive note as well.
Something else, like I know I was just talking about things to say to your family members. I think it is important because no one, if you're having like a dinner, let's just say this, or you're doing a Thanksgiving, or you're all meeting up, you're doing whatever you're doing with your family, and you're having conversations with them, none of them want to be presented as bigots, right? Like, you know how the race and the racism, the other R word is something that's just like so deeply offensive sometimes to white people, and they're like, oh no, I'm not a racist. No, trust me, I understand this. I have a deep understanding of this topic. Well, the same thing applies. No one wants to be outed as a transphobe. So if you're talking to your family members about it and they're talking about these topics, there's usually going to be a but, right? It's going to be like, no, I have nothing against trans people. I'm completely fine with them, and I wish them the best, live and let live, and that's where I stand on it. But I just don't think that we should be giving hormone blockers to kids, things like that. Have these conversations with them. And this is the one time where I'm going to not advocate for any anger, because it is more important to change minds. It is more important to convince them of the actual science behind this and be like, all right, I understand that you're concerned about that, because your concern is obviously for the safety and welfare of children, and that's where you're coming from in this case. And I'm not talking about Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott is a deeply hateful, spiteful bigot, and basically just wants people to suffer for his own enjoyment and amusement. So fuck that. But I'm talking about your family members who may be like, well, I'm for gay rights. I voted for Obama, or whatever it is, right? Talk to them about this issue. And when it comes to trans children, you have to explain to them two very key things. One, the incredibly high rate of suicide that is experienced amongst the trans community, specifically amongst trans kids as well, is a direct result of the stigmatization of society. It is not because something about being trans makes you more predisposed towards having suicidal ideation. That is not true, and numerous studies have come out in opposition to that. It is because of the way society stigmatizes them. So we want to reduce the amount of children who are trying to attempt suicide. We want to destigmatize the conversation. So we want them to feel as safe as possible, all right? And make them feel as valid as they should feel for being who they are, in the same way that every other person and people with privilege like myself get that just by virtue of being cis in a majority cis society. That's what happens. The second thing being, like, I understand, again, for the welfare of the children, you probably are thinking, well, I just don't want them to make serious life decisions. That could negatively impact them down the road. Explain to them that, again, meta studies on this, the vast majority of people who do transition, even from an early stage in their life, do not regret it later. It is not something that is an overwhelming phenomenon. The few stories and accounts of when it does happen are the ones that are amplified by the right and the far right and everyone else who is looking to oppress trans people. So they will take a single story where it's like, this person regretted transitioning, or this, or whatever it is, and that is the one that's going to get all the prime time on Fox News and being like, oh wow, this is a serious problem. We need to talk about this. We need to protect the children against this potential outcome, an outcome that is not representational by any measure. So overwhelmingly, the amount of people who do transition say it helps their gender dysphoria. So that is something that is also important. And then finally, when it comes to hormone blockers, they are reversible. Children are not the ones undergoing gender reassignment surgery. That is not something that happens. That is something that is being fed to you, again, by media personalities. And that lie, it permeates in society, and people start to believe it. They sit there and they're like, oh, well, yeah, but I don't think that we should be, performing surgery on children. We're not. And by we, I mean the medical community is not doing that. That's not something that's on the table. Imagine for a second, you and everything you went through and the horrors of high school or whenever it is that you went through puberty. Imagine that, and then add to that, between the acne, the voice changing, the people making fun of you, trying to figure out so many things in life, your first crush, all the shitty aspects of high school. In addition to all of that, you are then going to go through puberty and start to experience physical changes into a gender that you do not identify with. That's in addition to everything else. So, like, that's one thing I would have loved to be able to just, like, propose to a Joe Rogan, who sits there being like, yeah, well, I don't want them, abusing children or all of this. Like, hormone blockers is something that has been used in the medical community for a while now. We have a vast amount of knowledge on its effects, especially its effects on children. And it is also used on cis children for a variety of reasons. So these are very, very safe. These are reversible procedures, and they do overwhelmingly help. So if you were going to come at this from a child abuse angle, you are ironically advocating for the abuse of children. And if you can make that flip, if you can get them to just switch their perspective on it, in the same way that a lot of people used to believe that homosexuality was a choice, that being gay was a choice, that people were choosing, and if they could only understand or have the sanctity of the Lord and God's love come inside them, they would realize the error of their ways, the sinful error of their ways. And for that, we have things like conversion therapy. For that, we have things like, again, a form of child torture, where children have to be forced to basically undergo a variety of procedures, which again tortures children, which can result in children wanting to commit suicide because they feel that they're now inherently evil or bad or sinful or going to go to hell or whatever it is for the way they are born. And again, all this comes down to that. This is not something that children are being influenced into. This is not something that is like only suddenly now becoming a very big topic because there's more kids identifying as non-binary than ever before, or identifying as LGBTQ plus more than ever before, and that seems to be a huge problem. A lot of that has to do with they feel safer now identifying that way, or there's more knowledge available to them at a younger age to make them understand these aspects that when I was a kid I had absolutely no fucking clue about. No, none of this was talked about when I was a child. None of this was talked about when I was in high school. I had no idea about any of this. Like, I'm one of those people who fully started to have an understanding and a grasp of trans issues from watching, huge YouTubers like ContraPoints when that stuff was first becoming a really big thing. Like, that's how far behind the times the cis community is in their understanding of this. And so for that, yes, if you do have family members that you're trying to talk to, that you're trying to convince of all these topics, it may be that you can't sit there and belittle them. You can't, because you're going to shut the conversation down. If you're going to be like, oh, dad, you're just a fucking transphobe, blah, 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 you're a bigot. Boom, fine. But then that's one less person who's going to maybe have lunch with his coworkers someday where they're sitting down and they're all having coffee, and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, it's really fucked up that they're trying to give kids puberty blockers and stuff like that. Well, then in that moment, maybe that next step, he could sit there and have his coffee and be like, well, I don't know if you all know this, fellas, but apparently it's not actually as bad as they make it out to be. It's not actually really child abuse at all. In fact, it legitimately helps them. It reduces their suicidal ideation. It's reversible. And the vast majority of children who go through it don't regret it later in life. That could be that conversation. And of the other three people he's talking to, one of them could then have that conversation when he goes home to his dinner table, and so forth and so forth. Like, spreading this information and getting more people to understand it, because again, you have the science on your side, you have the facts on your side, and you also have the civil rights issue of this entire argument on your side. So people are going to push back up to a certain degree, but eventually it's going to you're going to block it. Like, it'll eventually stop when people are like, well, that makes sense. That makes sense. Like, I remember convincing people in high school who were very, very anti-gay back in the day, who were saying like, blah, 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 they choose to be this way, blah, 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 they're choosing to do this or that, they're just F-slurs who like to suck cock and stuff like that. I was like, do you think they're coming to high school every day and enjoying the experience of getting beat up? Do you think they're coming to high school every day and enjoying the experience of being made fun of? Do you think they're coming to high school every day and enjoying the conversation that we're having right now, where you talk about them like they're degenerates? Do you think someone would choose to go through all that intentionally? Or are they having to do it in addition to just trying to feel validated for who they are, right? And even like the most ardent like bigots at a certain point or another were like, I guess logically that's true. Why would you choose to have a harder life? That doesn't really make sense to me. Okay, all right, maybe I see what you're talking. Okay, well, maybe it's not a choice, but it's still gross. I'll leave it there. Black Cat Lex, thank you for the $5. They said, I advocate, yes, I'm also thinking people who need to detransition needs our support and care to avoid this kind of mistake, which is less than 1% is education, space to explore gender. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And obviously, choose your battles where you can. We all have a limited amount of like, energy, magic dust or whatever. Like if you are spending 3 hours a day arguing with parents who happen to have a very backwards view on all this and making no progress, then yes, expend your energy elsewhere. Try to convince the friend of the friend who still is a holdout on this, or try to convince the aunt or the uncle or something like that. But like, use your energy where it can. Use your energy and basically try to compartmentalize all of this, right? Maybe there's only so many X hours you have in a day to be able to actually talk about this or even think about this without getting completely and utterly depressed or beside yourself or angry or enraged, and at which point it's hurting your own mental health. So choose when and where you want to make your inroads, but they are important to be made, especially if you, like myself, are in a position of privilege where, you can talk to fellow cis people, have conversations with fellow cis people, and try to get them on board. Like in this day and age, there is a much smaller percentage of people who are either going to say things like trans people aren't real, right? Like I'd say we've made progress in that one, but there's still a very large contingent of people who believe that things like puberty blockers are abusive to children. So that could be the next inroad that someone makes, Mental juice. Thanks, Jeff. Good way of explaining it. Save your mental juice for when your mental juice is most effective. Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form. Available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we beseech thee to smite down our enemies. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble court jesters, here to amuse you. To our lords, Trevor R., we give thanks for this spit of land for us to eke out this meager existence. To our knights, Merid, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruby Kelly, Ellie Leslie, Alex P., Brandon, Words Greenwood, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Val 9000, Jenna Tall, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Yanis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Saren 42, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our flag in a veil, and we salute you, our friends.